a lot since I lived there.
And say hello and again, happy September 30th. Can you believe it? The last day of September. Where did that go? We have the amazing Brandy and Dominic here from CDE, who are going to share with us a little bit on the hot topic of degree of support. Degree of support. So, Brandy, thank you for jumping at the chance to do a quick 1 hour presentation. And for all of you, if you do have questions, put them in the chat. And Brandy, do you want to do your questions at the end of the presentation? Would that help?
No, actually, as we go throughout is totally
Okay,
fine.
fantastic.
Just because if I can catch you in the moment, or you can catch me when we're on that topic, that would be great. So,
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Brandy, thank you so much for being here. And thank you all. And I'll let Brandy take it away.
okay, you're welcome. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Uh, I see everybody else, from what I heard, is experiencing the heat like we are. So, it's going to be in the hundreds here in Sacramento this week, which is insane, right? Um, so the first thing I wanted to say before I get into this presentation is this is also intended to be more of a conversation. So please, if you have thoughts or if you have burning questions about anything that I'm presenting, please feel free to chime in, just ask your question. Because the other thing, as I was telling Jennifer before she started the recording, was that this is the first time we're actually presenting on this topic. In isolation. And so what we'd like to do is deliver this training out statewide. So you are also going to be helping us kind of fill in some of the gaps where there's content that we needed that wasn't there. I just want to make sure that everybody can see the screen. Yes. Okay. Great.
Yes.
All right. So as Jennifer said, my name is Brandy Jauregui. I'm an information technology supervisor in the data evaluation and analysis unit for the special education division, or CDE. If you do have questions related to degree of support, what we're asking is that you actually funnel those questions. If I can't answer them here today, or you think of them later, funnel your questions through CalPADS-support at cde.ca.gov, which is essentially the CalPADS help desk, because typically they will land with one of my staff, but we can at least keep track of it through the CalPADS service desk. All right, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on how we got here. Okay, so in July of 2022, July 1st of 2022, the Commission on Teacher Credentialing issued 2 new authorizations for education specialists. And those authorizations were for mild, moderate needs, support needs. And I'm not going to go through the entire authorization statement, but as you can see, I bolded out content, which is this authorization authorizes special education to support students with mild to moderate support needs related to one or more of the following disabilities. So there were a set of identified disabilities that educators could provide instruction and support to with this mild moderate support needs authorization. And it specifies the grade levels of transitional kindergarten through 12 and through age 22. Now, what is important here is it goes a little further. There was a work group that was convened between CTC and some of the special education focus monitoring and technical assistance team members to kind of help build out the definition for this authorization statement. And for mild moderate needs, it authorizes the education specialist to provide instruction and supports in one or more of the following domains. So academic, communication, gross, fine motor, social emotional, behavioral, vocational, and learning environment access skills. And it may also include health, movement, and sensory support. Okay, so also the MMSN might also include lower student-to-teacher ratios. The extensive support needs um, authorizes an educator to support students with extensive support needs related to one or more of the following disabilities. So it's the same group of disabilities, the same age of students, and grade levels 1 through 12, and, or excuse me, transitional kindergarten through 12 and up to age 22. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting. So the definition for the extensive support needs authorization is that this specialist can provide intensive instruction in 2 or more of those areas. Okay, so academics, communication, gross fine motor, social, emotional, behavioral, vocational, and adaptive daily living skills. So that's one distinction between uh, mild, moderate support needs and extensive support needs. And the supports also often include health, movement, and sensory support, whereas the mild, moderate authorization may include, but extensive support needs often includes health, movement, and sensory support. Is everybody familiar with the special education authorization chart that the Commission on Teacher Credentialing publishes? And if you are, you can just thumbs up. And if you're not, I will go. And I am posting the degree of support one more time for you. Oh, Dominic, thank you. Good job, Dominic. Okay, so the CTC published an authorization chart that outlines which students can be taught with these 2 new authorizations, in addition to all of the other credentials that the Commission on Teacher Credentialing offers. What I'd like to do is just real quickly take a look at that document so you can kind of get a sense of what the Commission on Teacher Credentialing is looking for. So give me one sec. Okay. Hopefully you can see the authorization chart. Is that what you see? Make sure. Okay, yeah. And if you can't see it, just somebody just say, I'm not sharing the right thing. So this chart, as you can see, the first 2 authorizations are the mild to moderate support needs. Okay, this is the authorization code that's typically used by your credential analysts. It authorizes specific grade levels, in this case, K to 12 up to age 22, and adult education. So the mild moderate support needs credential authorization allows the teacher to teach students with a support level of mild to moderate. And then the extensive support needs authorizes students with extensive only. And as you can see here, it also identifies the specific primary disabilities, primary or secondary disabilities actually, that can be taught with these authorizations. So mild to moderate does not authorize teaching students with deafness or hard of hearing, deaf blindness, visual impairment, or adaptive PE. And the extensive support needs authorization does not authorize teaching students of deafness or hard of hearing, visual impairments, or adaptive PE. Okay, so this also has all of the existing credentials and authorizations that the CTC currently issues, along with the primary disabilities that each of those authorizations is authorized to teach, along with the grade level and student support level. As you can see here, the majority of these credentials, with the exception of the mild, moderate support needs, extensive support needs, most of the legacy credentials are authorized to teach any student support level. Okay, so I have any questions about that? Okay, here, PowerPoint. All right. So this is all coming. So I provided you a little bit of background, and the reason that background is necessary is because these assignments for teachers are evaluated in a system called the California State Assignment Accountability System, otherwise known as CalSAS. And every single year, beginning in 2019-20, districts are required to take a look at all of the course assignments that happen on the first Wednesday in October. You guys commonly know it as Census Day or CBEDS Day. And they are required to review assignments for teachers, pupil personnel services, and administrators. Okay, so what we're talking about here specifically are teaching positions for teachers that are teaching in special education settings. So that's the focus of this particular presentation. But annually, LEAs have to review all teaching assignments for all of their staff every single year. And this now includes charter schools, right? And so what that system does is, so this is just a really high level overview of the CalSAS system. As you can see, starting on the left, All2 is our data collection in CalPADS that collects course and staff data. Okay, so the staff data that are collected obviously are the statewide educator IDs and all sorts of demographic information about a teacher. And then we have course assignments. Which courses are those particular teachers teaching? And in many cases, we also have to look at the student populations within that course to determine whether or not the teacher is appropriately assigned. The two demographic groups that I'm specifically talking about are students with disabilities, okay? And the other one is English learners, right? So we have to look at the student populations in order to evaluate whether or not that teacher is appropriately authorized. So, and the staff and course data are collected and certified by districts in the Fall 2 data submission, which is typically certified in March annually, okay? Then around the June-July timeframe annually, CDE forwards a master file of all of those course assignments for teachers and certain characteristics about the student populations. Now, for students with disabilities, primarily it's, here's a course, this is the setting in which it's being taught, okay? And again, we're talking about teachers teaching in special education settings, which means all of the students within the class are students with disabilities. If that is the case, then all of the primary disabilities of the students are actually identified as well, and we provide that file over to CTC. Then they compare it against the teacher's credential and authorizations, and they run it through this set of logic, which they call their decoder. So it's, this teacher can teach this course and this group of students, this age group, based on their credential and authorization. So once they run those data through the decoder, they compare the credential and authorizations against the course and staff data. CalSAS generates something called questionable assignments, or they're otherwise known as exception. Okay, so anytime you hear the word exception in the credentialing realm, it means, hey, there might be something wonky with this particular assignment. You want to take a look at it. Ultimately, every district has what we call a monitoring authority, okay? And that monitoring authority is typically a county office of education credential analyst. That monitoring authority has the ability to take a look at that particular assignment and any justification the district provides, and they make the final determination. Okay, they can say, okay, this is an appropriate assignment. This is not an appropriate assignment. So any questions about the CalSAS process? And this is done, by the way, their window for monitoring opens on August 1st annually and concludes in November. Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So why do we need the student degree of support? So we have these two new authorizations. And as you know, it specifically says in the authorization chart that educators with these authorizations can teach students that have either mild, moderate support needs or extensive support needs. But guess what? When we looked back at the data, CalPADS never collected any information on the individual support need of a particular student. We just didn't collect it. And so in order to do that, CTC asked CDE to begin the collection of the degree of support that a particular student would need if they had one of the following primary or secondary disabilities. Now, these data are not required right now in CalPADS. So if a student does not have a degree of support populated in the 24-25 academic year, you're not going to get an error in CalPADS. And that was because we made a decision to allow LEAs to populate these data over this academic year in preparation for requiring this piece of data in fall of 25, 26. Okay, so the expectation is that anytime that there is a triggering event for a student, so by triggering event, I mean they're having their annual plan review, they're having an eligibility reevaluation, they are making an amendment to a student's IEP, they're having an initial evaluation, and that student has one of these primary or secondary disabilities, that members of the IEP team and or special education data staff will ensure that this piece of information is populated in CIRUS. So Brian, can you talk a little bit about what checks you have in CIRUS to ensure that this is populated?
Sure, Brandy. I was just responding to Carolyn. What we have in place is if you were to log into CIRUS now and you go to click on search. So if anybody's logged into CIRUS right now, following along, you click on the search button, and then we have a number of predefined queries. So this type of query would fall under something called compliance concerns. So you open up the compliance concerns area of queries, and at the bottom right of the corner, you'll see a button called degree of support required / missing. And what that does is it will build a query, and it searches all the eligibilities you listed earlier, and it basically looks for any records where the primary or secondary eligibility matches the criteria that we have in the degree of support document here. It also makes sure that the kiddos are not in preschool. It's like TK and above. But basically, if they are active and it's not filled out, it will come up on this list. And so we know that not everybody's ready to fill it in immediately. So one of the things is if we do validate or you try to finalize a meeting and it hasn't been filled in yet, there will be a warning to remind you that this is an opportunity to report this in this meeting event if you've already had it filled out. But not having it filled out won't prevent you from closing that meeting, because maybe you're going to have a meeting next year where you're going to go through the list of the kiddos and have the team together and just power a bunch of them out. And you can fill them in when you need to. And if you're doing it that way, you could manually archive it at that time, or however you want, or if you have, if it's being done in a meeting, it can be reported that way. But there's many different ways to report it. It just kind of depends on what plan is going to work best for your district. So if you're curious about it, you could reach out to us, say, hey, this is how we're planning on doing it. Well, then we can advise a best practice to get those things entered and reported up to CalPADS. And then the other thing I would say is we also have it to where someone tries to enter a degree of support for an eligibility like VI that's not on the list, it will not let you put that in there.
Good. Now, as we get closer to the end of the year, it's going to become really important for districts, even SELPA, to be keeping a close eye on, as Brian said, that compliance report, right? Because once you get closer to the end of the year, Let's say you don't have the degree of support populated for some of your students, and then come beginning of the year, you need to submit up some amendment because you have matriculators, right? They're going to high school, and amendments need to be submitted. Well, if you try to submit up those amendments, they're not going to go through because you don't have that piece of information populated. So it's going to be really important to be watching this, particularly towards the end of the year. The other thing that's important to remember is CTC is actually not going to use this piece of information until CDE has had a full year of requiring the data. Okay, so what that means is we're going to begin requiring it in fall of 2025, which means on Census Day of 2025, the expectation is that students, the applicable students, will have that degree of support populated. Then once they certify fall 2 data, and the hope is that by next fall 2, we will have this particular piece of data incorporated into fall 2 as well, so that you can see on your course rosters what the student's degree of support is in CalPADS. That's a plan for next year. And then the August 2026 CalSAS monitoring cycle. So in August of 2026, they are going to be evaluating the 25-26 academic year data. So that's the first time you're going to be able to see the degree of support being evaluated by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. Okay, just checking here in the chat. Then it says we have all of our students updated with degree of support. However, we have validation errors warning saying some of our students' degree of support is not required. And is that what you were talking about, Brian? It's not required because they don't have the appropriate primary or secondary disability.
Yeah, like if the student's primary eligibility is like visual impairment, that's not on the list, so
Right.
it's not included. So basically, on I think it's slide 6, all the eligibilities that are listed, we search for those. If you want to see which ones are listed, just go ahead and click on the button in Cyrus, but it basically matches that. So we only are inclusively looking for the eligibilities as stated in the CDE directive.
Right.
If they're not on that list, we don't want them.
Yeah, and keep in mind that when we do start collecting this and requiring it, we are only going to limit the submission of this particular piece of data for students with those primary and secondary disabilities. It's going to be limited to that. Okay, so if you have it populated for a student that doesn't need it, it's going to get kicked back. All right, so who is responsible for determining this? So as many of you probably already know, degree of support is not part of the legal IEP document. Okay, it actually lives within the student data sections of your special education data systems. So what that means is it's a collaborative effort. So members of the IEP team, the special education data coordinator should evaluate data within the IEP to make this designation. Okay, so there isn't a specific person or groups of people. It's a collaborative effort. So it's not necessarily something that the IEP team is actually going to discuss within the IEP meeting and document on the legal IEP document. But it is a discussion that would need to occur between the special education data coordinator and members of the IEP team, and actually using the guidance document that we put together. And I'll show you that in just a second. But just to be clear, this is not part of the legal IEP document. It lives elsewhere within your special education data system. And Brian, what's the section of Cyrus that this lives in?
Oh, where do you want to, doing the data entry or the query?
The data entry.
Okay, the data entry is on the primary place to do the data entry is in the special ed area on the right-hand side of the MI summary page. Some CELPAs has asked for the degree of support to also show in the IEP manager area as well, and that was added as a data entry convenience. So there's 2 places you can enter it. but it's basically a field either on the MI summary page or somewhere in the IEP manager area if your SELPA requested that of us.
Okay, so it's in the IEP manager, but but it's not. Just to be
As
clear,
far as I
it's
know,
not
it's
part
not,
of,
I mean,
no, it is not on
it's
the
just, I don't
IEP.
think anybody's asked for it to be on the forms because it's,
Right.
as you said, it's not an IEP thing, it's sidereal. But we put it there because they might be in the point of having a meeting. You got the
Yeah.
staff from there who can advise and just pop it into the meeting. And then that way it'll go, assuming that the parents accept the plan, then that plan will send it. If you're in a situation where you have stay put after stay put after stay put, you may need to manually archive the MI summary page at least once with the active status, which would include the most recently agreed to plan, which may be a year or two old. Doesn't really matter at this point because it'll have a transaction date of the day you send it today or this academic year, and then you'll at least get the most recent plan, and CalPads will have that data. Kind of like, the same technique we use to fix a SPED 619 or Plan 619. Just sending a new plan with the updated information.
Perfect. The other thing that I wanted to say was that it's probably pretty important that at some point internally you also come up with a local process for indications where this degree of support would have to be reviewed and validated. How often does that have to happen? Or what are some triggering events that might cause a change from mild, moderate to extensive support, right? So those are just things that you need to take into consideration because although for some students it's going to remain relatively static for their academic career, it is possible that a student could move from extensive support needs to mild moderate support needs, but probably be forward thinking about what are the characteristics or how often does it have to do we have to review the student degree of support? Because again, once you populate it, the assumption is that it's going to stay there in perpetuity until someone changes it, right? But what are the things that would trigger a change? All right, so how should you make the determination? So we worked with some SELPA representatives to put together a guidance document. And that guidance document is available at the link that was on the PowerPoint. So many of you, if you want to download that document, and actually, Dominic, if you could just post the degree of support guidance document in the chat, I would forever in your debt. Thank you. So what we did was we worked with a group of SELPA representatives to kind of come up with a not only some frequently asked questions, but also sort of a guiding questionnaire that would help IEP team members and special education data coordinators make these determinations for each student. Okay, so it outlines which students with disabilities require population of the degree of support field. We did make some modifications to this document from when it was first issued. As you can see here, emotional disturbance is now emotional disability. Okay, and actually we had erroneously omitted emotional disability initially. So it also clarifies why it's being collected, which we kind of already went over. What are the definitions for mild, moderate, and extensive support, which we also went over, but just in case other folks within your LEAs need this information. Which staff are responsible for identifying the degree of support? And is it part of the legal IEP document? These are a lot of the things that I just covered in the preceding slides. All right, so now we get into the guiding questions. Okay, so is the student on an IEP? If the answer is yes, then go to question 2. If not, stop, because this question is only for students that are on individualized education programs. It is not pertinent to students that are on IFSPs or individualized service plans. Okay. Is the student's grade level PK through 12, including adult age students with disabilities and transition programs? If the answer is yes, go to question 3. If not, then you stop, because it does not apply to infants pre-kindergarten or adult students. And when I say adult students, I'm not talking about adult age students with disabilities in transition. That should be grade level 12. This is actual individuals that are in adult education programs. Okay, Steve. If your SELPA wants the degree of support option not to appear on the IEP manager for eligible students, please email me. Some SELPAs do and others prefer that it is not. Okay. Question 3. Is the student's primary or secondary disability one of the following? Okay, so those are the applicable disabilities. So if it is not, then you do not have to populate degree of support for that student. And again, we're looking at primary and secondary disability. Okay, is the student's primary or secondary disability 300 deaf blindness? If no, go to question 5. But if yes, stop. So first thing you can do when you talk about pre-population of the degree of support, if you have any students whose primary or secondary disability is deaf blindness, those kids will always be extensive support needs. Okay. So you can pre-populate those. The next question, is the student eligible to take the California alternate assessments? Okay, have they been identified as eligible to take the Cal Alt? So now this question, you have to make some local decisions. So generally speaking, and most of the SELPA representatives that participated in this work group agreed. So generally, students that are taking the Cal Alt are extensive support needs. But again, this is a local determination. You can make that determination locally. There may be kids that take the Cal Alt that may not have extensive support needs. But generally, those students taking the Cal Alt will have extensive support needs. So if you could also pre-populate any students that have designated the Cal Alt as extensive support needs. All right, so then moving on to question 6. So they're not eligible for the Cal Alt, and you're unable to determine the degree of support using the preceding questions. Then you have to take a look at all the domains for which the student requires support in their IEP goals based on their primary and secondary disabilities. Mark all that applies. So what are the areas in which a student needs support? Okay. And then the last question is, now, does the student require intensive instruction and supports in 2 or more of the domains? Okay. So remember, extensive needs is instruction and support in 1 or more of the domains. Extensive support needs is intensive instruction in 2 or more of the domains. Okay, so you have to evaluate all of these domains and determine whether or not the student needs intensive instruction in 2 or more of these areas. If they do, then the student support need is going to be extensive support. Otherwise, it'll be mild and moderate. Okay, so do I have questions about this? All right. So that leads us to the one issue that we've been grappling with lately, and it's an issue that SELPA's raised several times, which is, what does intensive mean? What does intensive instruction mean? And bottom line is, when the work group was initially convened and they put together the definitions for the authorization statements, unfortunately, this is not an area they sort of dove into. And so there is no current statutory definition for what intensive means. In absence of this, right now, because CDE does not have any specific guidance that really helps define intensive. You would have to make this designation based on a local determination. So this would be a local decision as to what intensive instruction and supports means specifically in your LEA. I've been told that in order to clarify this further, it would probably take a change in the authorization statement to further clarify intensive. And that's a much longer process. So as of right now, you would just have to make a local determination as to what intensive instruction supports means within your district. Now, Jennifer, there was a question that you did put in your email before about therapeutic learning. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
So our therapeutic learning programs would require intensive support, meaning that they're going to have, mental health counseling, they're going to have specialized academic instruction, there's going to be additional work from specialists in those programs. So knowing that, my head would go to labeling those students as extensive support needs in the degree of support. But many of our teachers in those programs are mild to moderate support needs teachers.
Okay.
So my question was, would our staff take a look at those differences and mark those students mild, moderate support needs to match their credentialing, or would they, would
So I'm going to give you the answer CTC
look
would
at the other?
give,
Mhm.
right? So the answer that CTC would give was that the student should be assigned to a teacher that can provide the support, the degree of support they need. So if those particular students need extensive support in 2 or more of those domains, then the teacher who is their teacher of record in that special education setting should have a credential that authorizes extensive support. So if they're newer teachers and they only have the mild, moderate support needs authorization, I can tell you that that'll probably generate a misassignment. But the other thing that I should say is we are really hyper aware of the staff shortages. We're completely aware of that, and special education is one of those areas that has a very, very high need. So having a misassignment, although it does reflect on the dashboard and it is reported out on the Commission on Teacher Credentialing's website, and potentially it may affect any Title I funding, depending on how many misassignments you have. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but what I would tell you is that if the students have an extensive support need and the teacher does not have the appropriate credential or authorization, then it's going to result in a misassignment. And so what you're seeing here is just some resources that I've made available for you. Our CalPADS code that's document. This is where all of the degree of support codes live and their associated definitions. There's also, you can sign up for the CalPADS listservs if you haven't already. There's frequently asked questions, and I believe we do have a couple of frequently asked questions about degree of support on our FAQ page. The CTC appropriate credentials. This is actually a really great dynamic website where you can plug in a specific course code and a setting, and it'll tell you what credential and authorizations are required. So this is basically, I talked about that decoder that CalSAF uses to figure out whether or not a teacher is appropriately assigned. Well, they've basically put the decoder logic in this website. So it tells you exactly what you would need. The Administrator's Assignment Manual is essentially the credentialing Bible. CTC also has a listserv, and then there's some specific credential FAQ information at the very last link on this page. So with that, are there any specific questions that I did not address? And again, even though you're populating degree of support for all students with these primary and secondary disabilities, it will only be used and evaluated against a teacher's credential and authorizations if it is taught in a special education setting. That's really important, which means a special day class. All the kids in the class are students with disabilities. Okay, if the class is identified in CalPADS as a special education setting, that's when not only the primary and secondary disabilities come into play, but also the degree of support. Okay, so if some of these kids with mild, moderate support needs are mainstreamed into gen ed classes, their degree of support will not be evaluated. Any other questions?
Brandy, I have a question. This is Kristen.
Hi.
Hi. I see a connection with your last statement to Jennifer's question. So a lot of our students with emotional disabilities have extensive needs, but they're being primarily supported in an inclusive or mainstreaming setting. And so I heard kind of two things. I heard one, yes, they have extensive needs. And then two, but if they're not spending maybe the majority of their day in a separate setting, that they would be considered not extensive needs. Can you clarify my thinking or
yeah.
help me?
So the needs of the student may be extensive, but the teacher that is the student's teacher of record. So if they are mainstreamed and they're attending classes with a teacher in a general education setting, that's the key here. If they're going to let's say they're in elementary school and they're in a self-contained class with a gen ed teacher and they're receiving support services outside of that gen ed classroom, that their support need may be extensive needs, but they will never be evaluated against that teacher's credential ever, because that student is not being taught in a special education setting where 100% of the students are students with disabilities and the curriculum was specifically designed for students with disabilities. Does that make sense? So you can still populate their support need. If for whatever reason they were placed in a special day class, okay, they went from being mainstreamed and included to being put into some sort of special day class, then that would kick in. So it's only for students that are going to be on census day in a special education setting, aka special day classes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem. Does that alleviate some of that concern?
I think we're still all just wrapping our brains around it, but it helps. Thank you.
Just a question, Brandy, knowing we have long-term subs in various positions that do not have credentialing at all, will that affect this? I heard you say no, but I just wanted to hear
So
that.
it depends on whether or not it's a vacancy.
Yes.
Or just a long-term sub. And so that there's a difference. So with a vacancy, it means there is no teacher of record.
Right.
Right. There's a substitute in there. And in those cases, the substitute would have to hold the appropriate authorization, credential and authorization. If there is a teacher of record who is on leave, doesn't matter even how long, right? It could be a year. But if there is a teacher of record, then the teacher of record will be evaluated against the their credential and authorizations is going to be evaluated against the student.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what we should be doing this year is populating this information as, as IEPs come up, basically,
Correct.
right? And not pre-do it like ahead of time necessarily, just as their IEPs come up, then we're populating that degree of support, so that by the end of this year, effectively, or right at the beginning of next year, this would be all complete.
Sure. And but there are some ways that you can try and knock some of them out of the way. So for example, the example that I gave you for deaf blindness, all kids with deaf blindness are going to have extensive support needs. So if you find all of your students that have a primary or secondary disability of deaf blindness, you isolate those kids and just have your special education data coordinator populate their support need as extensive support. And then you don't have to do it during the IEP process, right? The other one is identify students who are eligible for the California alternate assessments. Okay, maybe not all of them will have extensive support needs, but certainly some of them. So you could evaluate those and identify the students that will have extensive support needs, and you can knock those out. So there are some of these you can get out of the way before their IEP comes.
Okay. And then going back to, like Jennifer mentioned, we have programs where we have students with emotional disabilities. So they are in self-contained classrooms, special ed setting, and they do receive what I would consider extensive services. But our teachers, my understanding is that they're authorized to teach these programs under the mild, moderate, as well as the extensive support needs. Both credentials can teach that type of class.
Well, it just depends on the student population, right? Remember that we've never had this information before. We've never actually captured the student degree of support. So right now, you've been assigning teachers with the mild, moderate, or extensive support needs authorization to these classes, and they're getting through the assignment process. And that's because this piece of information is not being evaluated yet. But once it gets in there and you have in a special education setting, so it's a special day class for students with emotional disabilities, and some of the kids in that class have extensive support needs, it is going to require a teacher with a credential and authorization that authorizes extensive support needs. So either the extensive support needs authorization or one of the legacy credentials that can teach both.
Right. So if someone right now has like a bridge authorization that includes those other areas, then
then you'd be okay.
They're good.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And that would be evident on that chart that I showed a little earlier. So if you look to see which authorization that teacher has, and in the student support need section, if it says all, then you're good.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Or they show it? Okay.
Yeah, I had a question. Bob Altavella here. What if I have an ED child who spends most of their day in gen ed setting, but they have an aide. So they're a majority of the day in the gen ed setting, but they have special ed for, say, let's 60% of their day. That would not count as intensive support needs, would it? Because they're in the gen ed setting all that time. So it's not based upon the service, it's based upon the setting, correct?
So in that scenario, you have a student that is in gen ed for some of their day, which would be one assignment, right? And then presumably they might be in a resource class or a special day class for the remainder of the day. Okay, so here we've got two teachers here.
We have an aide. You have an aide and one in the classroom.
Right. So you have an aide in the
teacher.
mainstream classroom.
Right. You have two teachers, correct?
Okay. So you have the gen ed teacher with an aide, and is that gen ed teacher going to be held accountable for having an appropriate authorization? The answer is no. But in the special education setting, the teacher that is assigned to that class, where they're in a special day class for, 40% of the day, that teacher will be required to hold the appropriate authorization for extensive support needs.
Okay, I guess I don't understand because I thought you said if it was most of their day in a gen ed setting, it didn't apply.
Right. Well, it's not most of their day. Remember, they're evaluating each of these assignments separately, right? So you've got general education for, 60% of their day. There's a teacher that's providing that gen ed instruction. Okay, so that is not a special education setting.
Right.
But if for the remainder of the day, they're actually in a special education setting, they're in a special day class where there's one teacher assigned to one group of all students with disabilities. And that class has been identified as a special education class in CalPADS, then the degree of support will be evaluated for that student and that teacher's credential and authorizations. Does that make sense?
Even though the kid is not in there the majority of the day, it's not a special day class.
Correct. Okay, so it's not a special day class. You're saying it's pull out. Is that what you're saying?
What's that?
Pull out instruction?
Yeah, that's basically like a learning lab type thing, right?
Okay. So it honestly depends on how you're capturing it and whether or not it's being captured in the master schedule within your student information system. So I would work with your student information system coordinator to see how it's being captured. Because in some scenarios, they'll create a course section for these teachers to be able to report their assignments. But in also some cases, what they'll do is they'll report that teacher as a resource specialist, right? And they will send up that assignment as a resource specialist and they're not required to submit a student roster with those kids. So I would need to take a look and see how it's actually being reported in the master schedule, and then I could probably answer that question better.
I think we have it down as an ed specialist for the purpose of assignment.
Right. And so I would need to take a look at the course record that's being reported in CalPADS to tell you whether or not that potentially could generate a misassignment. So if you want to reconnect with me at some time, we can actually take a look at the data.
Okay.
And I can tell you whether or not it might create a misassignment.
Okay.
And I see Beatrice has her hand up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes, thank you. So with that explanation you were just given, let me know if I misunderstood. You mentioned that SIS system will be capturing the information for the teacher in the course. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so from now on, for the teacher, we should be able to input all the information that is required for the credentials in there as well?
So most student information systems do not capture credential information. So that's the missing link here. A lot of LEAs expect that they can, they're inputting teacher information and they're creating these class rosters, and that the student information system will generate some report that says, hey, this teacher doesn't have the correct authorization. So that job typically lies with your credentialing units, right? Do I have a teacher that in this assignment that's authorized to be there? So that is a missing piece that does not currently exist in student information systems. What does exist is just basic demographic information about the teacher. And then you do have to populate lots of information about the student. And then of course the degree of support will come from CIRUS.
Okay.
But you would need to check with your credentialing staff to verify that the teacher has the appropriate credential to provide support to the students in that class in a special education setting.
Okay.
One thing I'll mention about a legacy CIRUS feature that may or may not really be applicable here, because you're not going to want to store primary information here, but If you go into the manage users area of Cyrus, you'll notice that there is a tab called personnel data. Those of you familiar with the old CASEMS program will remember that we used to be able to store personnel data in the CASEMS program and report it, or that would be a template that would then be reported separately. So we built that into the program a long time ago. If at some point it looks like it'd be useful to have this kind of information, let's say linked with an HR system in the district, this is a potential vehicle to do that for maybe some later development. But if you want to have a local place to maybe store some notes about a particular staff person, check out the personnel data tab and give us some feedback if you think that might be a workable solution for information.
That particular tab, by the way, does have an area for credentials. I don't know how up to date it is, but it does have a section for that.
Okay, do I have any other questions?
Brandy, knowing that we may have, I'm still stuck on the Therapeutic Learning Center scenario. We may have a lot of staff that are mild, moderate support needs staff teaching students who should be coded ESN. Is there, and I'm sure you're going to be finding this out because there's going to be those misrepresentations a lot with this new degree of support. Is there some conversation around supporting additional credentialing to get that ESN background for staff that maybe would have an interest to get that?
You know, I do not know. I have not been privy to any of those conversations, but I can certainly dig a little deeper and find out. You know, if you want to just shoot me a tickler email and with the specific scenario, I can reach out to CTC to see if there's been any conversations on how exactly these situations could be handled. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking, because isn't the intent was, like you said, 2 or more domains. So, and also those students who would be eligible to take the CAW, for instance, those are students with disabilities that require that intensive modification of, curriculum they're presented with, whereas the emotional disability students are typically on, the accessing grade level content. So that's where, to me, that's quite different,
Right. And honestly, it just depends on the domain that you're looking at, right? So if you have students that need extensive behavioral support, extensive emotional support, then that might bump them into the ESN category. But the one thing I just wanted to really clarify and kind of what I'm seeing here that's missing that you guys are not privy to is whether or not the teacher's credential and authorization is going to be evaluated against this degree of support is entirely dependent on how your district is reporting courses and teachers, data for teachers providing instruction to students with disabilities. It's entirely dependent on that. Because again, the only courses that are going to be evaluated they look a certain way in CalPADS, right? So you'll see the teacher, the specific content that they're teaching, and then they'll have this code. It's called an instructional strategy code of 700. And this is in your master schedule component of your student information systems. So all of those courses that have been identified as a special education setting with an instructional strategy code of 700, those kids that are enrolled in those courses, that's when the degree of support is going to come into play. So it's really important that your district take a look at all of the courses that have been identified as special education courses and the associated teachers. That's who it matters for CalSAS purposes. So, and Jennifer, I don't know what those therapeutic learning centers look like in CalPADS. I don't know what they look like. Are they being reported in the master schedule? Are they being reported as special education settings? I would have to take a look at that. But it's important that you find out because remember, folks that are managing the student information systems and the master schedules are sometimes so far removed from special education that they may not be reporting it correctly. So, you know, you just kind of have to take a look at what they're doing. And I'd be happy to find out in some instances if any of you want to reach out to me directly. We can take a look at your courses and see what's happening.
Great. With that, we are at 3 minutes after. So Brandy, I want to say thank you so much for this great information. To all of you that are left here, thank you for hanging in there with us. And Brandy, are you able to put your email in the chat? Would you be
Oh, yeah.
okay with that? In case there were lingering questions. Additionally, I'm happy to reach out to Brandy if you do not, if you lose that email, gather our questions and maybe create a template with questions from our county.
Absolutely. Feel free to reach out. Thank you all for hanging in there. And, you know, I know it's the end of the day and it's a Monday.
Well,
Thank you, Brandy.
thank you,
you.
Brandy, and have a wonderful day. And thank you to Cyrus for being here with us. Brian and Steve, thank you so much for being
course.
here as well.
Thanks,
Have
Jennifer.
a great
Thanks,
day,
Brandy.
everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.